Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, it's always really exciting to get to come back and work with you again and see some familiar names, I guess, virtually that I've gotten to meet in the past. So, and I love talking about amphibians, so it's a good night. So I just, thought that Kevin came up with a really clever name for our program here, and I had to make sure that my frog here had a crown on the front page. So making sure that we're having fun with it all. And so today I'm just going to talk about a little bit about the background of amphibians and how they differ from reptiles. And then I'll ID some common ones. And since we're talking about the Northwest, I chose some of the most common ones that you'll find in both Oregon and Washington. And so there may be ones you know of that I skip over. I wish I could talk about them all, but we'd be here for quite a few hours. And while I might enjoy that, not everybody does. So, so we'll start with that. And then if you own property, I'll talk about some things, some habitat enhancements you might be able to try to encourage amphibian habitat. Okay, so amphibians evolved from fish about 360 million years ago. And because of that, they still carry some of the aquatic characteristics from fish. And they're unique because they require both aquatic and terrestrial habitats to complete their life cycles. So often we refer to them as biphasic, meaning that they require both water and land. And that's actually where their name amphibian comes from. And it's a common misconception that amphibians are mostly aquatic. A lot of people think because they're often around water and because they need to keep their skin wet that they hang out in water all the time. But that's actually not true. Most amphibians are primarily terrestrial when they're adults, and they only really interact with the water when they're breeding or in their larval stages. Of course, there are exceptions. There are some amphibians that are completely aquatic, there's some amphibians that do like to hang out around water often, but most of our amphibians are quite terrestrial as well. That juxtaposition between aquatic and the terrestrial lifestyles make amphibians pretty centralized to quite a few food webs on both water and land. So they're important for both of those ecosystem types. For example, tadpoles are omnivorous, and they are prey for aquatic insects, fish, and birds. And then adults are carnivores, and they are prey for birds and mammals, excuse me. So, and then that trait that amphibians kept from fish is that their eggs are similar to fish, and they can't tolerate dry conditions. So all amphibian eggs have to be moist in some way, which is why most of them breed in water. So do a quick quick explanation of how amphibians and reptiles are fairly different. Some of the main ways are their skin. Amphibians tend to have a smooth, moist skin. Sometimes it's sticky, and they have mucus glands. So there's a lot of permeability in amphibian skin, whereas reptiles have scales, and their skin is actually underneath those scales. Amphibians' eggs, as I mentioned, have to be soft, are soft and have to be wet. And reptiles have an amniotic egg with hard shells and leathery eggs, so they can be more dry conditions as opposed to amphibian eggs that always have to be moist. Amphibians all of our local amphibians have short forelimbs and long hind limbs with 4 or 5 webbed digits, and reptiles have 4 limbs, except for, of course, our snakes. And then amphibians actually metamorphose. They come out of their eggs in a different state than they are as adults, and they transfer into the characteristics of adults through metamorphosis. Reptiles do not have a metamorphosis phase. They look like a miniature adult version of them when they hatch. There are some exceptions. Our lungless salamanders that are completely terrestrial hatch as mini versions of adults just because they don't breed in water, so they don't have those gills and a tail. And then for the defense mechanisms, amphibians tend to have toxic secretions in their skin. Some of them can bite, whereas reptiles have, strong nails and teeth. Some of them have venom, and they have scales that protect their body. So those are the sort of differences, main differences between the characteristics of amphibians and reptiles. So there's two types of amphibians that we have in Western Oregon and Washington. Sorry, I still haven't fixed the slide from this afternoon. We have frogs and toads, and salamanders and newts. Frogs and toads tend to have longer hind limbs, an external ear, and they don't have a tail, whereas salamanders and newts look a lot like lizards and are often thought to be lizards at first for people who aren't sure. They have 4 legs and a trunk and a tail. So their skin tends to be the one that secretes that layer of mucus to protect them. And some of them can even secrete that just out of their tail or even drop their tail when they're threatened. So the difference between frogs and toads is not really scientific. It's actually based loosely on their lifestyles. Frogs tend to be more aquatic. They have smoother, moister skin, webbed feet, and long hind legs that they use for swimming and jumping. Toads tend to be more suited for terrestrial life. They have a more squatted appearance, and they tend to have warty, dry skin with poison glands behind their eyes. They also have relatively shorter legs than frogs, and they tend to walk more than they do jump to travel. Salamanders and newts are the other set, and salamanders typically have a longer, more rounded tail with well-developed toes for digging, whereas newts have webbed feet and a paddle-like tail, which makes it easier to live in the water. So salamanders tend to be more terrestrial. They tend to burrow underground in the summer months, and newts are often found close to water. They can be very terrestrial, but they're also found swimming in water quite frequently. So I'm going to start IDing some of the common species that we have around here, and I've split them up based on where they like to breed. And so this first group of amphibians likes to breed in lentic, or what are called stillwater wetland habitats. So those can be either ponds or sloughs, lakes, or any wetland that really doesn't have a high current. They're looking for a current less than 5 meters per second velocity. So really slow. These are fresh stillwater ponds, and they're often considered one of the most important habitats for Northwest amphibians. So much so that wetland ecologists seriously consider amphibian species abundance and health as an indicator of wetland health. So an ideal pond for breeding has a circumneutral pH, so something that sticks around 7. The ponds stay full of water for at least 6 months of the year. There are at least some non-shaded shores, and that's important because there are some fungi and molds that can affect frog egg masses if there's not enough sunlight. We want low water fluctuation, so we don't want the water to, over a short period of time, get really high, which can drown the eggs by not having enough oxygen, or get really low, which can have them dry out. And we don't want that to happen. And then emergent vegetation is also really important. So that's the type of vegetation that's rooted in the substrate of the aquatic habitat and grows through the water and emerges out the surface. And that's typically where amphibians lay their eggs, as well as the tadpoles swim through to find food and forage, and to also hide from predators. Most of our natives breed in these ponds, and they typically only come to the ponds for breeding, and they're here for about a few weeks before they return to their terrestrial environment. And then it typically takes a few weeks to a few months for them to metamorphose depending on the species. So it's really the combination of this wetland breeding area and the adjacent upland forests that are really critical for these stillwater breeding amphibian survival. So our first one that we're going to talk about today is the Northwestern salamander. And the Northwestern salamander is a type of mole salamander. It can be fully aquatic or it can be biphasic. And it's typically brown with these prominent dark brown eyes and parotid glands on the back of their head. So I'm going to scoot my pointer over here. These are those glands that I'm talking about. And they also have poison glands on their tail. And they can be 5.5 to 8.5 inches long. And they are, you can find them in a variety of habitats, so woodlands and forests in particular, as well as grasslands. And they love to spend their time underground and in rotten logs. So most of the species, most of the salamander species I'll talk about are nocturnal or love to be underground and in rotten logs. So if you want to see some of these, you might have to be open to doing some digging. Their breeding season is February through April, and their egg masses that they lay actually are here in the center here. They have an egg that's surrounded by this jelly film, and then there's an external jelly around that, and it's about the size of an orange or a grapefruit. And if you were to pick it up out of the water, it would be hard and it would hold its shape. So there's typically between 50 and 200 cream-colored eggs within each one of those egg masses. And once the egg is hatched, the larvae mature in 12 to 14 months in higher elevations. Sometimes it takes longer. These Northwestern salamanders, if they decide to stay in their aquatic phase, they will maintain these shorter limbs, as you'll see here on the bottom left, and they'll maintain this set of feathery gills here at the base of their head. So they won't ever metamorphose into that adult stage. You'll see them on terrestrial land. They'll sort of stay here with these shorter limbs and gills. These are considered mildly poisonous because they can generally survive along predatory species as a result. They do, however, when they are bothered, take on this defensive posture that I've changed the picture here in the upper left, and you'll see this milky secretion that comes out of its tail, which is somewhat toxic. So that's how they try to defend themselves from predators. Our next common species is the long-toed salamander. These salamanders are named for their long fourth toe on their hind feet. They look a lot like some of the terrestrial salamanders that I'll talk about later, but that distinction is that fourth toe that's much longer than the others. They do always have a stripe on their back. However, it can be solid or blotchy. There's no common pattern to that. And their sides often have these white or silver flecking on them. So they're really pretty, actually. They're typically around 6.5 inches in length as an adult. And these guys eat insects and crickets and beetles and things like that. They're also forest dwellers, but they can also be in meadows and brush, and they're subterranean as well. They like to be underground under bark and rocks and rotting wood. You'll notice this theme, and so think about that when you're thinking about your management plans for amphibian habitat. Their eggs are quite different though than the Northwestern salamander. They're 0.1 inches in size, and they're covered in this soft jelly. So if you were to pull it out of the water, it would lose its shape, as opposed to the Northwestern salamander that held its shape. And they lay about 85 to 411 eggs in clusters of 10 to 13. So these breed a little bit earlier. They're one of the more earlier breeding amphibians that we have, January through March, especially after rain events. They hatch after 2 to 5 weeks, depending on temperature, and they'll metamorphose within 3 months. So that vegetation, they're looking for a little more limp vegetation than a sturdier vegetation that the Northwestern salamander would need. And then I had a question earlier about the different colors here. on these range maps. And if you see a different color, it's of the same species. They're just a distinct subspecies population. So the long-toed they're both types of long-toed salamanders. They're just tend to be separated by geographical range. Okay, rough-skinned newts. These are the ones that people see the most often and usually know the best. They're brown and they have this rough, warty-looking skin, dry skin. And their bellies are typically a bright color, yellow to orange to red, depending on where they're found. They can be 3.5 to almost 8 inches long, including the tail. And when they're bothered by a predator, they take on this defense posture that you see on the upper left-hand side. So they'll show off their bright colored belly and say, I'm really bright colored, I'm poisonous, don't eat me. And most things don't eat it because fish, ducks, bullfrogs, owls, and humans have all died from eating this newt. They do carry a neurotoxin, which makes them quite poisonous and is the most, and so there are some common garter snakes that are high in resistance to this poison, and they are able to prey on rough-skinned newts, but it's pretty rare that they don't typically have a lot of predators. As humans, I know a lot of people in this area grow up playing with these because they're quite common. But and if you touch them, you'll be okay. Just be sure to wash your hands and don't touch your mouth or your eyes because you don't want that neurotoxin to get into your body. There have been people that didn't know they were toxic and eaten them and have died as a result. So just be careful. Should always wear gloves if you handle the amphibians. We always recommend to try and view them from a distance. So these species lay their eggs in January through May, and you'll notice that they this ball of newts here on the right, and so this is during breeding season. There's one female in the center there, and then she's got a bunch of guys around her interested in courting her for love. So eventually one of them will be a victor and the two of them will swim off together. Her eggs will become fertilized, and then she'll lay them singly, like this picture here. Take delicate care to wrap them in vegetation. They're very difficult to find these eggs just because they're laid singly and in hiding quite well in the vegetation. And they're often not preyed upon either because they contain that same toxin that the adults contain. Pacific tree frogs are the most common. They're ubiquitous throughout both states. They're the most abundant frog in the region. They are 1 to 2 inches in size, and they have a highly variable coloration from brown to green to red to bronze, even some goldish flecking coloring. And some of them are solid in color and some of them are mottled. It's really quite interesting to see all the different kinds. One of the things, though, that distinguishes them so that you know that they're a tree frog is this mask that they have that goes from their snout all the way through their eye and past their shoulder. And that's sort of indicative of a Pacific tree frog. And then their chest and their belly are a creamy white. They tend to have yellow legs underneath. And they tend to call in these large choruses. So in the spring, when you're hearing all the croaking, that's this frog. This is why they're called Pacific tree frogs, but they're also commonly called chorus frogs. And that's because they all sing in unison. And actually, movie producers and sound engineers use the croak of this frog for that quintessential croaking that you'll hear in the movies. Unless it's a bullfrog, and bullfrogs are that guttural sound that's quite different. But this is the common movie star frog that makes that croak. These frogs also have soft jelly around their eggs. They lay in clusters of 10 to 80, and each female can lay 20 to 30 clusters a year. So they attach theirs to a softer vegetation as well, or sticks work as well. and it's also, if you were to pull it out of the water, it would lose its shape. These breed from February to May. They're a little bit later. They tend to like really warm, sunny locations, and their larvae will take 2 to 3 months to metamorphose. And these are pretty easy to tell the difference between the males and females because the males' throats have this really wrinkly look to them because they expand quite large, as you notice in the bottom left picture, when they're calling for mates. Then we have northern red-legged frogs. Northern red-legged frogs also have a dark mask. It usually stops before their shoulder. And they have these 2 dorsal folds that are on their back. So it's really these just 2 ridges that go along the edges of their back. They're usually tan or brown along their back, but sometimes can be fully red when they're juveniles. They get their name because when you flip them over, their legs are red in color. And it's usually quite pronounced throughout their whole lives. These frogs are actually one of the most terrestrial species that we have. They can travel 5 to 7 kilometers from their breeding ponds, but they always like to stay within 10 meters of water. So they have to be within 30 feet of water just to make sure they're always staying moist. Their egg masses are quite large. They tend to only lay 1 egg mass a year. They can lay 750 to 2,000 eggs in 1 egg mass. And their egg masses are a loose jelly. It kind of looks like a bundle of grapes when it's sitting in the water, but once you pull it out of the water, it sort of collapses into your hands. It has a very dark egg with a single jelly around it that are stuck together. And so those are pretty distinguishable from the other kinds that we've seen so far. They metamorphose first in the summer, and then they head off and head straight for forest lands. Western toads are the most common toad on or the only toad we have west of the Cascades. There is another toad east of the Cascades. I'm not going to talk about that one today, but Western toads have a dry, warty skin, and they have pronounced glands behind their eyes. They have a pretty stocky body, and they grow to be between 2 and 6 inches in size. You can identify them from that dorsal stripe that they have on their back. So if you, in all 3 of those adult pictures, they have a sort of what looks like a light green to tan line that goes all the way from their nose down to their bottom. And it almost looks like a glowing green color when they're swimming in the water. It's actually, it's pretty nice. You'd think they would be able to, they'd hide themselves a little better, but you can see them really well swimming in the water with that stripe. These breed from January through July, and they breed communally. So you'll notice in this bottom picture on the left that these 2 pairs are in amplexus, which just means they're breeding, and they're almost on top of each other. So, and then there's a bunch of eggs around them. So they actually all breed communally. They take cues from the temperature, and they all show up at the same time and breed and lay these eggs. Their eggs are laid in 2 rows that zigzag within a jelly column, and they're laid on the bottom substrate of the pond. And so it often gets covered, as soon as they're laid, they often get covered in sediment at the bottom of the pond. And so when you find them, they look like these jelly snakes almost at the bottom of the pond. You almost can't see their eggs anymore. So they're jet black, and they can lay 1,000 to 17,000 eggs depending on their size. And then they all hatch, and then you have all these little toadlets that are collected together, and they all snack on the leftover jelly that's remaining from where they all hatched out of, and it's one of the cutest things I've ever seen. They're just all in a big circle suckling at vegetation and detritus and jelly. Okay, and so then we also have a pretty common species, the American bullfrog. This is actually a non-native invasive species, but I wanted you to be able to identify it if you find it. They were first introduced to the Pacific Northwest in 1895 as a food resource, brought over by immigrants from the South or Midwest. They wanted to bring them as a way to, for nostalgia for their calls. And then in 1920 to 1940, they tried to farm them, and they were dispersed and scattered around the countryside to try to increase farming for food. So they ended up being spread out around as a result, and taken over quite a few habitats, and now we have a hard time getting rid of them. So they're known for those large eardrums they have behind their eyes, and they have fully webbed feet, and their backs are smooth. They have a light and dark marbling under their head that goes all the way down to their toes. Our native Rana species usually have just a cream-colored belly. You'll see that modeling in their under their neck and in their legs, but often not on the belly the way that the American bullfrog has. You often don't see them. They're pretty, they're pretty shy. They camouflage pretty well, but you can hear that deep guttural ribbit. Or when you walk by them in a pond, the juveniles chirp before they jump in the water. So you'll hear this chip, and then you'll hear splash, and then you'll know that that was a bullfrog. None of our frogs make that sound before they jump in the water. In fact, the only other frog that you can hear besides the bullfrog is the chorus frog that I talked about earlier. All of our other frogs, if they call, do it at levels so low that we can't hear them. And a lot of them are being discovered that they actually call underwater. And so we definitely can't hear that. These species are quite advantageous because the females lay so many eggs. They lay over 100,000 eggs, and typically in the summer months. So it's past the breeding season of our native species. So right when our native species are in their larval stages or metamorphosizing into juveniles, bullfrog adults are in the area, hungry, ready to breed. And so there can be a lot of predation during that time. The one thing that's quite different is that American bullfrogs, their tadpoles require at least 1 full year in the water. So if you have a pond that dries up in the summer or by the end of the summer, then you won't have bullfrogs. But if you have a pond that stays wet all year long, they need that to be able to stay in their tadpole stage a full year before they start to metamorphose into adult stage. Okay, so now we're going to talk about our Lotic species. So these are amphibians that are stream associated, and our climate in Northwest is ideal for seepages and streams that support amphibians. They tend to have a smaller window of activity just because they tend to be higher in elevation, and these species are more prone to drying out, and so they tend to stay either buried or in the water at very cold times. The first is giant salamanders. So there's 2 types depending on where you are. And I'll have to make a little correction on this map here. The coastal, this is the range map for the coastal salamander, and then the Cope's giant salamander is on the Olympic Peninsula here on the side, which I'll talk about. So that part shouldn't be white. That should really be indication of where the Cope's giant salamander is. And so these salamanders can grow larger, a length of at least 13 inches. Copes are medium to large. They have short gills and are small, and they're mottled with yellowish markings, whereas the coastal giant salamanders are a little bit larger and have the marbled brown and black patterns on their bodies. They both grow to be quite large, and as a result, they feed on prey, including small fish and larvae of mole salamanders, along with insects and other things. They can also, once they're adults and they go onto land, they can also eat salamanders, lizards, shrews, mice, and even snakes. which they sort of are sit and wait predators. So they sit and wait for them to come by, and then they seize them, and they have really strong jaws. They hop out and they eat them. There are stream obligates, meaning they do require to be close to streams for breeding, rearing, and for foraging. And so they're always close by. They don't really go far away. And they prefer cold, clear, fast-flowing streams in moist coniferous or mixed coniferous deciduous forests. So the cope salamanders, like I said earlier, occur in the Olympics and the Washington Cascades, in the hills of southwestern Washington and northwestern Oregon. And the coastal giant salamanders are common in both states and occur in Washington and Oregon Cascades, in the coastal mountains of Oregon and California. So the cope's giant salamanders usually stay in the neotechnic state, which means they're aquatic. They can fully metamorphose, but they tend to stay aquatic most of the time. But both species can be either aquatic or biphasic. However, it's usually population specific. So if you only have, the discrete populations in localized areas, usually they'll either all metamorphose or they'll all stay aquatic, which I think is really interesting. And so we'll talk a little bit about their eggs. Their eggs are deposited in clusters, and they're attached to the undersurface of rocks or logs or timbers that are embedded in the stream channels. And the eggs are laid from spring into fall. They don't really have a distinct breeding season in that way, and they lay about 135 to 200 white eggs. So most of the eggs I talked about earlier were either cream or black, and these are very white. And the females tend to nest until their eggs hatch and the larvae disperse, which is quite interesting for amphibians. So our coastal tailed frog is the other Lotic breeding species that I'm going to talk about today. They tend to be brown, reddish, or gray, and they have yellow and gray mottling on their back. And if you can get up close, they actually have a vertical pupil, which is quite interesting. They had a lot of trouble historically when they were first identifying these species. They thought, wow, we have two identical species, except one of them has a tail. And the picture in the bottom left, the frog has this little tail, and that's how it gets its name. It took a while for them to figure out, however, that these were actually just male and females of the same species. So the females don't have a tail. They discovered the tail is not actually a tail. It's an external sex organ that the males have, which is very uncommon for amphibians, which is why they mistook it for a tail. So our tailed frog species, you can always tell the males from the females right away when you find them. These species are made for swimming. So they're incredibly buoyant. They do really well in fast-flowing water. They have their hind feet are webbed, and they're just really good. And they swim in asymmetric motions to avoid heavy currents and predators. They lay their eggs in, their eggs are quite large. They're about 1/5 of an inch, and they're entirely white as also. And they lay them in two long pearl-like strings enclosed in that transparent jelly. They attach them to the undersides of rocks as well, and both of the giant salamanders and tailed frogs do that just to protect them and to hide them. They hatch about 60 eggs, but often several of the females will nest together, so you'll find more than that in one spot. Their tadpoles are quite adapted to being in the stream. You'll notice they have a sucker on their mouth and a streamlined body and tail, and that helps them to be able to move easily in the water. And then when they're feeding, they suck onto rocks and sort of have these, you see those grooves are sort of like teeth, and also almost like an accordion that they suck and skirt their way up the rocks, eating algae and things like that along the rocks and logs and things in the stream. Once they metamorphose, they They eat at night, and they tend to feed on insects on the stream edge, and they usually stick around the stream most of the time as well. Okay, we also have a set of salamanders that are completely terrestrial, which means they breed terrestrially, and we often refer to these as the lungless salamanders. So they don't require ponds or streams to lay their eggs. Their eggs are often laid in moist, protected sites, so often in rotting logs or under moss mats or underground in moist areas, because even though those eggs are laid outside of water, they still have to stay moist. The most common and widespread one is called the Ensatina. Ensatina are really cute, I think, but they tend to be all one color. They're that tan, they're like a tannish brown color. And they are known for having this crimp right at the base of their vent and at the beginning of their tail. And that crimp there is, it allows for a defense mechanism for them to be able to drop their tail if they're being predated upon or if they feel threatened. Their tail will stay in one spot and wiggle to distract the predator while they run away. And then over time, their tail can grow back. They also have these yellowish markings in the crotches of their forelegs that are pretty distinguishable. They don't have any dorsal stripe. The one that I have here on the upper right side is actually not a species we find in this area. It's more common in California, but I wanted to have this picture because it shows a picture of what their eggs look like, and that they also nest. So they watch out for they rear their eggs until they become, they're hatched as miniature versions of adults. And this is actually the mother looking after the young, not eating them. So I get that question sometimes. But they look after their young as well, just like the giant salamanders do. And their name Ensatina actually comes from this elaborate courtship dance that they do. Right before they mate, they do a dance, which is I've never seen, but supposedly quite elaborate and fun to watch. And they're pretty active in fall rains as well. So, and then we also have the Plethodon salamanders. There's 4 different types that are found in the area. And so you'll have the dun salamander, the western redback salamander, the Van Dyke salamander, and the large mountain salamander. The most common one is the western redback salamander, and they have a full stripe from their nose to their tail. These salamanders are, they're all west of the Cascade Range, and they have those white flecks on their sides and on their belly as well. They tend to have really long, really long body with short legs. The western redback has a full stripe from nose to tail, whereas the dun salamander and the dun salamander has a more blotchy tail. These also are, tend to be underground and lay their eggs on land and are born in full miniature stage. Okay, so those are the main species that I was going to talk about. And so the other thing I wanted to talk about is their habitat. And the reason for that is habitat loss is the primary cause for population decline of amphibians in the Pacific Northwest. And a lot of it is due to habitat destruction or urbanization. So often, if habitats are removed for buildings or putting in roads and things like that, those wetlands are displaced. And so amphibians that tend to go back to those wetlands every year aren't able to find them to breed. They are quite smart though. They can find new ones, but that year is usually puts them in great danger because they're going into a place with a lot of human population and potential traffic. Urbanization causes high water fluctuations, which causes issues that we talked about earlier with drying out of eggs or suffocating of eggs. And then it also creates water toxicology problems. So typically an increase of petroleums, pesticides, fertilizers, and things like that in the water that can affect amphibians' ability to be able to hunt and reproduce effectively. Often, if there's a lot of toxins in the water, amphibians are born with mutations that make it difficult for them to perform those life characteristics and then tend to die earlier as a result. And then, of course, just barriers like big, heavy road traffic. There's a pretty significant breeding wetland in a Portland park, and then something like a 4 or 5 lane highway that's between that wetland and their upland habitat. And there's a large migration of those northern red-legged frogs every year to breed. And so there's actually a group in Portland that has started standing on the side of the highway and collecting frogs and bringing them to the other side to decrease mortality as a result of roadkill. So roads can be a big issue for amphibians. And so some of the ways that you can help is to foster healthy breeding habitats, whether that be healthy ponds or healthy streams. And if you're interested in building a pond, that's always a good thing too. Any size that suits your property can help. As I mentioned, the amphibians need to stay moist, and ponds can also be breeding habitats if possible. So you'll want a pond that has both sun and shade, a minimum of 20 inches deep, and that's to help with water fluctuations and to make sure that the eggs like to be about midway through the pond. That has some shallow gradient at the edges. It's not sort of like a deep drop off. Although deep drop-offs in some areas can be helpful because it decreases predation from birds like herons and things like that. You'll want lots of that emergent vegetation that I was talking about earlier, and about a 50-50 ratio of water to plants is usually a good plan. That's enough plants to be able to oxygenate the water and enough sunlight to be able to avoid algae to take over. And then you also want basking sites that protrude out of the water because the amphibians are ectothermic. They regulate their body temperature based on what's outside. And so they do need basking sites to warm up to be able to get their metabolisms moving. So with rocks, fallen logs, and things like that. And then in larger ponds, you can put floating platforms, for example, or things like that to make the ponds a little bit more basking sites in the center. And then good habitats and streams, things like making sure you maintain buffers if you're doing any forest management activities. Obviously that's for the most part, that's the law in both Oregon and Washington, but just in case, making sure that you do that. You maintain rocks and logs in streams so that the pools and riffles are still available. And that there's a minimum of sedimentation that comes into the water, maintaining that riparian vegetation to hold those banks in place. And then also maintaining some deciduous canopy over the edges of the streams. That really helps with leaf litter that falls into the streams and feeds the insects that a lot of amphibians feed and prey upon. And so those are really important. And then if you're going to build a road, you want to decrease the sedimentation into that stream and provide good stream crossings so that there's good passage for amphibians from the top of the pond to the bottom and the bottom to the top. And then you want to make sure that those ponds and breeding habitat are connected to their upland habitat, because most amphibians do use both of the forest and the wetland habitat. And so it's easier, and you'll see more amphibians, more types of amphibians, and a greater number of amphibians if there's more of this green stuff, which is the forested habitat around those blue ponds. And you can do that in a couple ways. And on your own property, I just thought this was funny, but it's kind of silly. But on your own property, even just leaving a patch of unmowed grass that offers cover for an amphibian to transport itself from a pond to a forested area. Even something small like that during the breeding season or during the migration season can be really helpful. And then, of course, ignore the turtle, pretend that's a frog. But this can also be good for reptiles. If you're building roads and you know it's a heavy migration site for amphibians, then there are different tunnel systems and different types of culverts that you can use to build underneath roads, so that with fencing that direct the animals under the road as opposed to over the road, so they're less likely to die from being run over that way as well. And then also in your forested land, making sure that you maintain that healthy terrestrial habitat. So lots of down logs and rotten logs, piles, lots of understory vegetation that maintain high relative humidity so that we have lots of insects for them to feed on, maintaining rocks and things like that. So pretty common to find in northwestern forests. And then you can also build some structures. So you can build some rock piles. The amphibians, like I said, were ectothermic, and so they like to be able to go down deep in the bottom when they want to be cooler, or hop and sit on top when they need to be warmer. And so having different piles of rocks with spaces where they can thermoregulate is really great. And then you can also make those out of old, garden stuff if you want. They don't have to be real rocks, but you can collect rocks on your property. And so just putting in little leaves and sticks and things like that so that they can move around to regulate their temperature. And then you can do the same thing with brush piles. And as you'll put the larger sticks on the bottom and then the smaller ones on top. You can have vegetation and dirt on top if you'd like. But just make sure there's a lot of spaces in the bottom, so again, they can move in and out as they regulate their temperature. And then just some quick tips if you're viewing amphibians. Remember that when you're going into wetlands, that they can be cold, and so you should bring a buddy with you, and they're quite mucky. It's easy to get stuck in the mud, and then if you get wet, we don't want you to get hypothermia. So always bring somebody with you and a change of clothes to be safe. My friend here is holding a stick with a yogurt container top on it, and that's because we're looking at egg masses, and just having that something that you can put in the water to put underneath the egg mass makes it much easier to see. You can identify if it's a sturdy egg mass or if it's a gel or a loose mass, or what color the eggs are, or about how many. So it's a great way to help with viewing. And then you can also look for terrestrial salamanders or things that aren't on ponds by looking under rotten logs, under moss mats, and things like that. Again, I recommend you wear gloves because the lotions in their skin can affect amphibians if you touch them. And then if you move anything, always make sure that you put it back in place. Oh, and then polarized glasses, like if you're a fisherman, wearing those glasses that help you see into the water a little bit better, help with finding those egg masses, tadpoles, and frogs as well. And then last but not least, this is just sort of more fun. This is a way for you to be able to add some structures to an existing recreation trail that you have on your property, or just a spot you like to hang out. Adding things like shelters, high grass areas, or those stick piles, or even making little homes. I thought these were cute. Some of these are on Pinterest, where you can use rocks and sticks to make a little home for your frog named Spike that you put outside. And then I just tell people to flag these structures so you can often go back to them and look under these moss mats to be able to find your salamander, or go near water, or put out water structures to be able to create stopover spots for amphibians that need to stay wet. Keep those rotten logs there, so those amphibians that need to lay eggs, you can dig through those rotten logs, and a lot of times you'll find salamanders. I found an Ensatina in a stump when I was hunting for mushrooms, which was super exciting. And then you can also make these rock piles, rock talus piles, and there's a little frog hanging out in there. So those are so just keeping those structures in one place where you can frequently go look at them can make finding and viewing amphibians a little bit easier and more fun. So that's all I have for you, and I hope you have some questions.
All right, thank you, Lauren. I see one question so far, and actually this is one I was thinking of too, is how do you encourage amphibians but discourage things like mosquitoes?
Ooh, that's a rough one. So there's I guess someone in our other class mentioned you can put in an air if you're going into for ponds. Usually a lot of them have a little bit of a current, but you can put in one of those aerators or a fountain to sort of help with some of the water movement. You just want to be careful that you're not creating a large enough current that it deters amphibians from breeding there. And so the amphibian breeding season, I believe, is earlier than mosquitoes. So you can turn off that device earlier in the year during breeding season, and then turn it back on later when mosquitoes are breeding. They do also make some products that you can put in the water, but I don't know how those products affect that discourage mosquitoes, but I don't know how they affect amphibians. So you'll have to read the label and find out if it would harm the amphibians.
All right, what is the term for the warning coloration?
The warning color, the term for the warning coloration can you clarify your question for me?
I think it's talking about like the yellow on the underbody of the newt. You know, is there a technical term for coloration that's meant to warn potential predators that they're poisonous?
There probably is, but I can't think of it off the top of my head right now. I'm sorry.
Hey, me neither. Let's see here. What about alligator lizards? They seem common where I live.
Alligator lizards are awesome reptiles. So they're pretty cool reptiles. There's a northern and southern species, and they get their name because they like to bite. They live in forests and in some drier areas, and yeah.
All right, and Catherine Wells has piped up a possumatic coloration, and I believe that is correct for the warning coloration. So thank you, Catherine, for pulling out that word there. Okay, here's a question. What are the amphibians' main predators, dogs or cats?
Well, it depends on the species. There's lots of predators. Snakes, raccoons, birds, dogs and cats can also go after predators. It depends where you are. It depends where you are and what of those species are around. So I always encourage people to, if possible, to keep your cats indoors. And to train your dogs to leave wildlife alone. I'm still working on my pup. She has a strong prey drive and likes to sniff the snakes in my backyard, but we're trying very hard to discourage it. So yeah.
All right. Is there somewhere we can go to learn more? And that's a great question. And in the follow-up email that you'll be receiving with a link to the recording is going to be a whole list of resources and publications and stuff for further study. Next, do Pacific tree frog tadpoles eat mosquito larvae?
I don't know for sure, but I would say that if the mosquito larvae are in the pond at the same time, I would bet that they do. The tadpoles will eat larvae smaller than them and other insects in the water. So there's a good chance. I can't say for absolutely sure, but I would guess yes.
I was gonna say, doesn't everybody?
No, I don't really want that wiggly thing going down my throat, I don't think.
Protein. All right. Are any of these species incompatible with each other, with the exception of bullfrogs being incompatible with everything they can fit in their mouths?
For the most part, our native amphibians play well together. They do predate on each other. That is common, but they do have some variation in their breeding habitat, breeding timing, and have a lot of other localized things that they eat, so that they don't tend to over predate on each other to the point where they decrease each other's populations like the bullfrogs do. So it is common for things like rough-skinned newts and Northwestern salamanders to predate on some of our other species in their larval stages, but I don't believe that any of them cause a significant reduction in populations where you'd want to exclude certain species from each other.
Okay, are there any recommendations or requirements for bullfrog management?
There's a couple things that you can do. If you have a pond on your property that dries out in the summer, then you should be okay. If you have a way to drain all the water from your pond for 1 year in the summer, obviously if you don't have fish in that pond, then that would kill all of the egg masses and the tadpoles for the bullfrogs. And if you do it later in the year, later in the summer, all of our native species will have metamorphosed and emerged by then. And so then you wouldn't be in danger of harming our native species. So that's one thing you can do. Of course, that's difficult if you have a really large pond, or if you don't have a way to pump the water out, or if you have fish. The other way that a lot of people do it is that they hunt bullfrogs or catch them. You don't need a permit to do that in either Washington or Oregon, I believe. However, you don't want to transport them because that can be illegal. So you do need permission from the Department of Fish and Wildlife if you're going to like catch a bunch of them and then take them home to eat them or something like that. You can have an invasive species potluck and try out frog legs. They were brought over originally as a food resource, but as of now, those are sort of the only recommendations that I have.
Lauren, have you ever eaten frog legs?
I've eaten frog legs, yes. Not bullfrogs, but I have tried frog legs.
And how are they?
It tastes like chicken.
All right, and we have a question. Are we seeing problems with the, I don't even know how to pronounce this.
Fungus?
Yes, thank you.
So it's not a huge problem in our local amphibians. The largest ones affected are western toads, but their populations seem to be holding steady okay. I believe that Oregon spotted frogs are also somewhat affected by them, but most of their population decline is as a result of habitat loss and then overlapping with bullfrog habitat niches. So we don't have major issues from chytrid fungus, but it is present in the populations, and it does kill some of the species, some of the individuals that we have.
All right. Outside of our own properties, how can we help protect and preserve our native amphibians?
Well, you can advocate for them the best that you can. So make sure you let people know all that you've learned about amphibians, about amphibians and what they need to survive and how to protect them. There's a couple of, there's some organizations that you could, that do some education as well. There's the Pacific Northwest Amphibian and Reptile Conservation Group. It's called PARC. It's mostly a bunch of herpetologists that get together and nerd out, but they do have a lot of resources for management activities and for education resources. But other than that, I would just say, and be careful, pay attention to where you're, you know, walking and driving. So if it's during a breeding season and you know there's a lot of migration of amphibians, to try to drive really slow, look where you're going. There's a lot of, they don't, you know, they can't move quickly, so they can't move out of the way of a car too quickly. And just things like that.
All right, very good. Any final questions for Lauren while we still have her? All right. Hearing none.
Thanks, everybody. You had some really good questions. You even stumped me on one, one or two. Made me smarter for the next class.
There you go. I was gonna say, if you only got stumped on one or two, you're way ahead of me on these. All right. Well, this is it. Webinar 24 out of 24 for 2020. So thank you all for being with us again. We sure enjoyed having you and spending time with you here, learning about all sorts of things, and a really fun one here to end. So thank you again, Lauren. And I will go ahead and close us out. Have a wonderful evening and rest of your summer, everyone. And we hope to see you in a future program.